All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Altair Insights Podcast. Today, we're joined by Adrian Tymes, who is a serial entrepreneur who built and helped run a number of startups from founding through acquisition. We're definitely going to talk about that. Also, his latest effort, CubeCab, which will be the main theme for discussion for us today, is about democratization of space access. And they are developing a dedicated launch service for 3U CubeSats without the hassle and delays of waiting for a rideshared launch. So hi, Adrian, happy to have you on, and thanks for making it.
Glad to be here.
Perfect, wonderful. All right, so we read quite a bit in your bio, so I think let's dive back first into your background, Adrian. So we would appreciate if you can share with us about your education, your background. Previous startups will be eager to learn about that, because we don't only discuss space here, we also talk about business, because on Altair Insights, space meets business, right? So we need both sides here. So yeah, please.
And that's actually kind of how I got into space, was through business. So jack of all trades, master of some. I've done this, that, the other thing. I've done infotech, biotech, quantum tech, nano, a number of startups, like you said. 4 of them successfully acquired. A number of them, well, just Silicon Valley. I'm Silicon Valley native, by the way. I've been doing it since mid-90s. Got out just in time for the dot-com boom. So obviously my first startups were in IT. I've bounced around a number of fields, learned very quickly how to make the startups. And again, that's how I got into business, or into space, because back early 2000s, there was a society around here called the Experimental Rocketry Propulsion Society. It's an amateur rocket group. One of the members wanted to go public, or wanted to go corporate company. And so I'd already been through the process of, this is how you found a corporation. These are these things you need to look at when you're starting a business, like what's your target customers, what's your starting budget, and so on and so forth. So I coached him through that. He then went on and it became somewhat successful. You may have heard of Maston Space Systems. The guy was Dave Maston.
Okay.
What has happened since then, I will at least say that for the period where I was helping him, he got a successful start.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So obviously times were different back then, as we're talking like late 90s, as I understand already, for the start. So yeah, the private industry was in a different place back then, right? So
yeah, the late 90s, early 2000s was when I roughly got my intro, and then I just had my ear to the ground ever since. And then around 2011, I'd heard of the problems that CubeSats had getting launched. If you don't mind getting into it, this is how CubeCab started. NASA came out with the NASA Nanosatellite Launch Initiative, or Launch Challenge. It was a challenge to launch the same family of rocket twice within a week. This was before SpaceX had done all this recent demonstration, so this is all a big thing back then. And I figured, they didn't say anything about how big the rocket is, so it'd be relatively easier to launch small rockets twice rather than launch big rockets twice. So I'll just make a small rocket. And it has to have a demonstrable commercial case. Well, you can launch CubeSats. Even back then, CubeSats were a thing. So went ahead, did the design, did quite a bit of the engineering, and then the challenge got defunded. Let's just say I had some insight into the reasons why, some behind the scenes, thanks to an FOIA. And I took that and a few other lessons learned and researched through 2013, first half of 2014, coming up with a more viable independent business case. Some of my friends, work colleagues, and other things started hearing of my efforts, just started gathering a team. Mid 2014, I was encouraged to form a formal entity and enter the New Space Business Plan. We did. And the results, you can see 2014, or if you go to YouTube and search on 2014 lightning pitch, you'll find the entire competition, and I think they've uploaded the individual speaker segments. I'm told we spoke to competition, but I like to let people see for themselves. What is demonstrable fact is we won. So we took that and, okay, we actually have a viable business plan here. Let's see if we can get it to work. Well, the engineering has taken a while to do, mostly not funded engineering, low end, just putting things out. Recently, we have come up, finished getting a viable design, so we've been looking around trying to get funding and got a few efforts on that. Once we finish that, we start bending metal, and hopefully within a couple years of whenever we can finish getting the funding, start flying.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and I'm sure you'll be fine, Adrian. But since let's take it a bit behind, right?
Mhm.
Let's go back a bit, circle back, and let's talk a bit about the small sat launch market, right? Because
Yeah.
currently, what trends do you see, especially with the rideshare becoming very popular and majority of the small sat launches being rideshare?
Yeah.
What trends do you see others, and what problem does this cause for individual pay companies that want to launch their CubeSats to space?
Okay, so they're small and then they're small. A lot of these so-called small launch vehicles are doing 100, 200 kilograms, which,
Mhm.
yeah, there's a market for that. But then there's the CubeSats, which are a few kilograms, like the 3Us we're talking, that CubeSat or CubeCab is set up to launch. Um, we aim for 5 kilograms to low Earth orbit. 5 is a lot lower than 100. People keep saying, "Oh, well, if you got a CubeSat, you can just do a rideshare everywhere." No, you can't. Um, yes, it's true that rideshare is cheaper dollars per kilogram, but then you have to wait for the rideshare to be available, and you have to go where the rocket goes, when it goes, have to be compatible with everyone else on the ride. It's basically like taking a bus or a truck everywhere. Great if there is service where you're going when you want to go and so on. If you're going to any kind of unique destination, or if you got a payload that's not really compatible, you're up a creek. And there's limits to how far down they'll go. Like if you go to SpaceX.com/rideshare, their public rideshare interface, and you enter a payload mass of 5 kilograms, the cheapest ride you'll get is well in excess of the 250,000 that we are promising for a dedicated ride for CubeSats. Now, granted, they're aiming for a much larger minimum mass. They're going after the 100s and 200s. Fine, let them do it. We're launching so small that it doesn't even make sense for them to really compete with us.
Mhm. Absolutely. And Adrian, can you speak a bit more about the technology, the launcher you're developing? So it's going to
Sure.
be much smaller, as everybody understood,
Yeah, yeah.
probably.
Okay, so
Yep.
like I said, if you think of the existing rideshare launches as buses or trucks, we're a cab. That's where I get the name CubeCab from, cab for CubeSats. We're doing a very small air to space missile. Basically, we fly off of F-104s. It's an air launch model, like most of your viewers have already familiar with. Similar to Virgin Orbit, except where Virgin Orbit was going for 100 or 200 kilograms, and couldn't quite get enough of market at that size. We're going for smaller, where there is a demonstrated enough market. Um, since there is a large market for these small satellites, over 100 launches of 3U or smaller CubeSats every year for the past several. I mean, there are databases you can look up for this. I think the Swart Route database is the best one. Anyway, um, it's 3 stage plus the F-104 itself. FAA insists for air launches, the aircraft counts as the first stage, so technically it's a 4 stage, but 3 solid fuel stages. F-104 flies up to 50,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, go at Mach 1.5, drops and releases, and just flies up from there. That way, we can skip over most of the lower atmosphere, so there's a lot less rocket. And per unit of delta V, a jet is much cheaper than a rocket, solid or liquid fuel. So that's how we get the price down to 250,000, which is still not the best dollar per kilogram, but we're dollars per the entire rocket, dollars per launch opportunity.
Yeah. And obviously, it would be very challenging to be able to recover that rocket, right? So it's not going to be reusable, right, Adrian?
Yeah, no, well, we have some ideas for eventually making a reusable rocket, but not our initial design. Not what we're calling the Cab 3A.
Mhm. Okay.
This would be
Okay.
like the Cab 3C or Cab 3N, depending on how long it takes for us to get there. But yeah, not the Cab 3A.
I understand. Yeah, I like that a lot. When I checked, obviously, and I read about your company, you mentioned that you were the FedEx or USPS of
Hmm.
the space launch,
Yeah.
which I found again amazing, and it's really cool. Again, you also emphasized again that their issue is with the dates. With the rockets when you want to launch
Hmm.
your payloads, right? So you'll be able to do a lot of those launches in a short
Yeah.
period of time, right? So you offer quick access and a chip at a relative chip cost, right? Which is dedicated as well.
Potentially multiple launches per day for across all of our customers. But launching in that kind of volume means that we have the physical capability to go as fast as next business day. Now, in practice, most customers are going to be waiting on FCC and other paperwork to get through. But as fast as that comes through, we can launch. For instance, one of the use cases I keep bouncing around has been termed developing at the near the speed of software. So in a software world, one of the keys to rapid development is the fact that you can just type in, build, deploy, and then test the thing right there for no cost and not waiting a while. Rockets, yeah, you're waiting a year or so to get a launch typically. Well, what if you get a launch every week for that particular program, and siloed out of the rest of our launch schedule? Well, that means you could say launch on a Monday, run tests on orbit Tuesday, Wednesday, write up lessons learned and redesign on Thursday, build a new satellite on Friday. And we've actually talked to SolidWorks manufacturers, Dassault. They said that they are optimizing their CAD software for the satellite market. They're more thinking like shave a month or so off of large satellite designs. We talked to their heads of engineering, and they confirmed that for a particular use case, for a CubeSat, where you're doing iterative design week by week by week, and if your setup was a proper cam environment and so on, yeah, you could go from concept to satellites in your hands in one day. So yeah, build it on Friday, ship it to launch site over the weekend, launch it next Monday, and just build, deploy, test every single week until you have something in orbit that's passed all of its tests, at which point you have space qualified hardware by definition, which is the key gateway that a lot of customers, including NASA, often say for, yeah, is the space qualified? If so, we'll buy it. And you just iterate until, fine, you have this new space gizmo, space piece of hardware that's okay. It's now passed all of its trials, and you can go sell, having done maybe 2 months, 8 iterations, whereas 8 iterations, we're doing an iteration a year. That's going to take a bit longer.
Okay, so that sounds again reasonable. And regarding the challenges that you faced along the way, Adrian, so one of the challenges which we currently see across the board, and the statistics are reinforcing that, is the times obviously have been different right now with the the recession and everything going on, and obviously the investment. So I would love to hear again what is the perspective of some of the investors that maybe you already had conversations with regarding your technology, because it is a bit different from the traditional approach, and I know that sometimes when there's deviation from traditional approach, especially in the space industry where the risk is high, right? They tend to be a bit more hesitant when investing in such ideas and startups and endeavors. So what has been, again, your interactions, and how again, what are the big challenges besides this that you see in your path? Right.
So we have tried to de-risk as much as possible. Problem is, there's a bunch of VCs who I call software VCs. They think they invest in everything, but they don't really invest in hardware. They say, oh, all companies have to have have to be able to get a bunch of customers before any significant external investment, and we only help you invest in scaling. Well, people will buy a half-baked website, but no one's buying half a hammer, let alone half a rocket. Hardware companies, especially space hardware companies like us, no, you do need to do major investment before the first customer, and a lot of VCs just don't get that. Then there's a bunch of others who make a big confusion about what small is. And I think some of them are specifically invested in some of the 100 and 200. So they want to pretend there's no such thing as any other possible niches, like, say, CubeSats or specialized service for this industry or that. Just no, anything that's not SpaceX is all exactly the same. No, it isn't. And yes, the 100 and 200 and 500 kilogram launch market is a little saturated. That doesn't mean that everything other than SpaceX is saturated.
Absolutely.
And then another problem has been the from the customer side, letters of interest. A lot of these VCs rightfully say, yeah, so show me some letters of interest. And quite a few potential customers, including NASA, including Planet, have been confusing signing a letter of interest saying that, yeah, if you did this, then we would probably, non-binding, be interested in buying this. With, yes, if you do this without having actually seen your stuff, we commit to actually buying this thing. Of course, we're not going to do the latter, but they confuse it for the former and actually have a policy of not signing letters of interest. And then the VCs say, oh, well, you're not getting any letters of interest. There must be no customer interest. And at the same time, I am like pulled out of trade show conference floors by people saying, "Adrian, when are you going to launch? When are you going to launch?" Oh yeah, there's interest in what we're developing, but
Yeah. So what would be your take on that? I mean, do you believe VCs should be more open and again more going on compromises, or should it be more companies like Planet, for example, and others more willing again to support the launch startups by signing again those letters and showing and registering their interest?
a little column A, a little column B. I mean, in Planet Lab specifically, I understand that they got burned by certain previous guys who promised the moon and never actually delivered.
Mhm.
But these letters of interest are non-binding specifically for that reason. Is you can say, yeah, if you get to this, then we would be interested in discussing buying this. It's not a commitment. It's just a yes, we were willing to say that there is interest. You can take this to your VCs to try to develop this. If you succeed, yeah, then we'll talk.
Mhm.
And they're not willing to do that. Uh, we managed to get a letter of interest out of NASA's CubeSat launch initiative, but that was like pulling teeth, and they're not willing to re-up it later. They're willing to verbally say that yeah, it's still good, but in writing, not so much.
Yep. And another thing, Adrian, is which obviously launching again that often, as you said, sometimes several launches a day,
Mhm.
especially which are all dedicated. So, how big of a challenge that is from a reliability and failure side of aspect, and how do you deal with that to ensure its safety?
So for that, we are relying on proven systems. I mean, yes, the Cab 3 might not have flown, but practically every single part of it has already flown. So we're just putting it together. Um, a high amount of testing, and also budgeting to have enough flights that say 1 out of every 20 rockets we can pull aside and run QA on to make sure that this lot is still good. Whereas with most rockets, you're building them in batches of 3 or even 1, where obviously you can't do that without significantly increasing your costs. So, like SpaceX will often do tests on the fly of, okay, your next one, yeah, the next rocket has this configuration. We've never tested it before, ever. We're going to fly because they don't fly often enough to be able to test.
Mhm.
Whereas with us, we make it back to 20. We test one of the 20 to make sure it's good, and we can fly the other 19 without significantly increasing our cost because we fly that often. Economies of scale. It's this proven practice in I don't know how many other industries. A lot of what we're doing has been pulled from the auto industry, but it just hasn't been applied to rocketry because not too many rocket programs have been able to get the customer base to launch that much. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem where how many customers would you say there are for a full ton of payload in one go per year? Even if we had all the rockets in the world, how or at almost zero cost, how many lunches do you think there'd be?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I probably don't have the data. I don't want to assume, but it would
Less than a
be to
thousand.
it would
Let
be
let
to
let even if they were like $1 for the launch, um, at the current practices, and not including human cargo, not including a space tourist, just raw hardware that's supposed to go up and live in space. Right now, it would be less than 1,000 a year. Now, over time, that kind of cheap launch or that extreme cheap launch would induce demand, and in a few years, you'd have quite a bit more. But right now, there's just not that much at those large scales. Whereas, as I said, right now there has been over 100 launches of CubeSats per year every year for the past several, even with the current rideshare challenges and so on. We're trying to introduce a service that will facilitate getting that to over 1,000 a year, of which we would like to tap a large portion. Not all of it, obviously. No one ever gets 100% in the market, but a fair portion.
Mhm. And how do you believe the recent regulations for the end of life, again, 5 years, the orbiting, how do you believe that affects, again, the market for the small satellites, the CubeSat
Um,
specifically?
so for in CubeCab specific case, this is one of the reasons why we are only targeting very low orbit, like say 400 kilometers or 300 kilometers. Uh, Keep it below the ISS currently. anything higher, and we encourage customers to bring their own satellites, or sorry, their own engines. There are commercially available ion engines, electric engines for CubeSats.
Mhm.
Very easy to just buy and put on as part of the payload. And that then allows the CubeSat to maneuver in orbit, which allows them to A, actively dodge any events or incoming objects on orbit, and B, actively end of life and deorbit in those 5 years. And C, this is also overall cheaper. So remember I was talking about the per unit of delta V,
Mhm.
jets being cheaper than rockets. Electric rockets are cheaper than chemical rockets, partly because they don't have to overcome Earth's gravity. You're already gone orbit and you have time to transfer orbits. So X amount of delta V provided by chemical engine, the CubeCab 3A, plus Y amount provided by a CubeSat ion engine is cheaper than X plus Y provided by something similar to the CubeCab 3A. Yes, the money goes into different parts, but again, overall cheaper mission.
Mhm. Absolutely. And how do you believe, Adrian? This is a bit of on a different aspect, but we've seen, many new companies that have been with their launchers, sometimes failing, like Firefly, and there was Astra, some of the issues that they had. Now, recently, we had some bankruptcies with the Virgin Orbit and with the, another company that was developing from Canada. I can't quite recall their name at the moment, but yeah, and basically, do you believe that affects the decisions of the customers when they're looking beyond SpaceX? So do you believe that plays a role, like those cases that occurred? Or do you believe they're still open to exploring new customers?
I'm not quite sure I parsed the question, but I think what you're saying is anyone willing to buy rides other than SpaceX? Which the answer is, well, yes. People are buying rides other than SpaceX. Part of the problem is there's only so many rockets and launch opportunities available. Um, you go to SpaceX, and I checked just this past week, and the first opening they had was next February, and it's currently April. It's the same case elsewhere. They're only making rockets so fast.
Mhm.
There is a bit of an inelasticity with regard to the supply demand curve. Um, yes, there are a lot of launch companies out there trying to get stuff out, but the demand exceeds the supply currently. Yeah, that could change. That could very easily change. But at the moment, demand exceeds supply. And any launch company that can find a unique niche that nobody else is really going after can probably defend that niche if they can serve it profitably on their own terms.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So from the legal perspective and regulations, right? So I know it's quite hard to obtain these licenses because there's many companies and startups developing those launchers, all across the world. Mainly, again, in US, there's probably, I think, over 50 companies that are just developing new launchers at the moment, if not more. But there's only so many. I think only 12 of them have the launch licenses, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So, how hard is that process? And how
It's a
do you
matter. It's a matter of mentality. What approach do you take to it? I've actually given a presentation on this FAA as customer, just based on CubeCab's own efforts so far to get a launch license, which we've gotten about as far as we can until we get funding, at which point the FAA will allow us to formally apply.
Mhm.
But you look at the regulations, and the safety isn't just there just because, oh well, they're arbitrarily imposing it. One, if your rocket that has an accident and kills a bunch of people, there's going to be liability. You want to try to avoid that for its own sake. They're trying to make sure that, yeah, you're probably not going to have that accident in the first place. It is possible for safety and low cost and reliability to all be aspects of the same design philosophy. A mission that goes right the first time is a mission that doesn't need to be paid to be repeated, is that much less insurance that everybody has to pay out, is that much more happy customers, which leads to that much more repeat sales, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So now I want to take it a bit off again, the technical side of it. I want to dive more deep into the team, right? That you have and more of a business aspect of it. So how large is your team currently, Adrian? And are you currently expanding the team? Do you have the team that's,
I have the core team that I'm going to start with. So myself, a finance guy, and a few engineers.
Okay.
Less than 10 people.
Yeah.
With a bunch of subcontractors. Like, for instance, the F-104s are supplied by a group called Starfighters Aerospace, and I'm not counting their headcount in ours. The F-104 going at 50,000 feet needs pressure suits. The pressure suit design people are subcontractors. Technically, we're even going with subcontractors for the solid fuel supply itself.
I see. And we always love to explore again the stories and how the founders meet each other. So would you mind again elaborating more on that again, how you guys came together and how you decided to create this project together?
Okay, so my CFO I have worked with on a number of prior startups, so he and I just knew each other already. The other engineers I knew through connections, through work, and through ERPS, and through a few other things where I was talking in general terms about CubeCab. For instance, my chief operations officer, the manufacturing guy, Dustin Still, had done a bunch of DIY improvements at Tech Shop. And he's a bit of a rocket guy, and so he's just, yeah, Adrian, so I'd like to talk shop about this. And so he and I talked and just, think you could get it together? And then likewise for our CTO and the other engineers.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so that's a great, we sometimes get, again, yours was more of already connected, so you knew the individuals.
I tapped my existing network, and I'm very much probably going to continue to tap my existing network as new openings come up. I do occasionally see resumes coming in, and I have to tell each one of them, we're not hiring at this time, because from an external point of view of, oh, give me a job, no, we don't have that kind of thing. We have, when specific opportunities come up, I think of people that I can trust for particular roles and use them. Eventually CubeCab may start hiring formally. Eventually, maybe.
Okay, I see. And that makes sense, absolutely. I mean, as a startup, it's, you only need the specific position that you need. And if you already have, again, technical team and you have the subcontractor, so it wouldn't make much sense, right? Especially in the early stages, right?
Yeah.
You get this first initial customers and you have the technology already in place, so it always goes. So,
yeah, I've been doing what's called lean startups for quite a while. I know about not gold plating things, not doing excessive just because there are so many conferences that want me to spend thousands of dollars just to attend them, and that's a particular expense that we cut out. I mean, yeah, occasionally we'll do a few of those, but most of them are just, okay, we're going there, why? And we're spending thousands of dollars plus airfare and hotel, why? I have to be kind of selective about that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, across the industry, like some organizations, and I'm not going to be calling them out, obviously, but they're speaking space for all, and then they're charging like thousands for every individual that wants to attend and take part of it. So how is that accessible to all? Not
yeah, I mean, right? I'll fully admit, $250,000 is not like your average mom and pop being able to afford their own satellite, but it is your average university being able to afford their own satellite. It is your own small company being able to afford their own starter satellite, with which they can prove a service, get initial customers, and get more funding to get more satellites, which we can then scale them up on by additional launches.
Yep, and I've heard a lot of stories, especially with the conferences, as you're discussing, right? You mentioned earlier that you often get, again, pulled from the floor, and asked a lot of questions and a lot of interest registered, right? So how effective are those conferences from your experience? Again, as you're saying, it sounds pretty good, right?
Honestly, they've been our most effective marketing tactic so far, is showing up, either working the floor or occasionally speaking.
Yeah, because from some of the companies which I have private discussion, and I'm talking into like dozens, if not 100 plus companies, Majority of them, they either break even from the huge costs of investment, right? Because they have to ship, again, the equipment, they have to exhibit, they have to travel, send 5-10 people, and, pay for registrations and all of those things, right? The hotels and all of those things, which accumulate sometimes to 200K even, right? Per conference, right? And some of the companies, they spend like million a year just for the trade shows and conferences, and what they realize, they either lose money or they break even. There's not much return, and it has become more of a thing of okay, I have to be there, or people are going to start thinking that I'm not doing good as a company and I'm going bankrupt, right? So
yeah, what our have to be there is we have social media presence. We post once a month.
Yep.
That has been more than sufficient for people to say, yeah, no, CubeCab is still there. Even if they haven't heard literally anything else about us, as long as we're making a post a month. I have lost count of the number of would-be competitors who've got websites and social media that were last updated 2 or 3 years ago.
Yep, there's a lot of
And
those.
and they don't formally shut down. They're never abandoned, but yeah, they're gone.
Yeah, pretty much. So again, you brought up social media, and I believe that's a very important aspect, right? Because now what we see space industry, even though it's very like futuristic, it's the future. I mean, space is the final frontier, right? It still seems to be a bit conventional industry. Would you agree, Adrian? So, especially on those aspects of communicating their worth, their mission to the individuals, right? So they're very much lagging behind on that. And you said once a month, so again, that's enough to show again your presence. But the thing with the companies, some of them, they don't even do that once a month, or if they do that, they basically, everybody is doing literally the same. So if again you took 20 posts of different companies out there in the same niche, and you just excluded the logos and changed the colors of the posts, you wouldn't even be able to tell apart if those are the same company, they're different. Who is that? What are they doing, right? So what's your opinion on that?
I would like to think, I can't confirm, but I would like to think that at least CubeCab's post, you would be able to tell it's not exactly the same as everybody else's. Maybe you wouldn't be able to identify it specifically as CubeCab's without the name and logo and stuff, but we at least don't just copy and paste what everybody else is thinking.
And some companies have took it beyond, obviously, just communicating, just this boring. For example, there's one company, I'm sure you're aware of them, so Orbit Fab. They've been doing quite a good job with communicating and making like engaging announcements and content for the even just everyday individuals who are just supporting them. It's their mission, right? So that's again, shout out to them, right? That's one. Okay, so another thing for the companies, and when we talking about space startups in general, right? What is some of the innovations, right, that you've seen with the CubeSat specifically, right, as you're working on launching the CubeSats? What are some of the innovations and some of the most creative approaches that have been developed or you heard that are being developed at the moment?
Well, one of my engineers would kill me if I didn't specifically mention that CubeSat or CubeCab has been working on as a side project on a debris eating CubeSat. Basically, if say Russia pulls another ASAT or something like that, this would pair with our next business day launch service, assuming we can get emergency authorization, launch it straight to where the debris happened before it can spread too much and just gobble up the small pieces of debris. Specifically, it converts the small pieces of debris into propellant to get rid of the debris as debris and create propellant for orbital tugs on orbit, right where you need it. So,
go ahead.
So that's one example. Another example of innovation I've seen is a literally living CubeSat, which is basically it's a plant shaped into a CubeSat. Attempt to make a vacuum adaptive plant and see how well it works.
Interesting. I never heard about that one before. So
yeah,
and that's being developed currently as we speak, right?
That was an idea that was being floated. I don't know if it's being actively developed, and I don't think I'm specifically allowed to say who. I will say that they, if I mention them, they are famous for being involved in all kinds of medical and biotech things, and that's as much as I can say about the identity.
Okay, perfect. So there's only a few of those. So I mean, people who really want to learn, they will figure it out. So and then you mentioned the ASAT tests, and how I mean, even though those are like prohibited, right, internationally with laws, I mean, how do we really prevent them, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
We've seen the sanctions and everything on countries like Russia happening, and that's not because of the ASAT, but they still continue to do what they're doing, for example, right? So
Right.
that's. Do you believe we should have sanctions like that or similar, maybe a bit lesser extent?
I think that active measures to actually repair and undo whatever damage would be a lot better, more effective than sanctions. It's just, okay, Russia, you can litter all you want. We'll just scoop up your litter. We'll just take this material that you're putting up there. Thank you. Well, maybe not thank you, because it's still naughty Russia for doing it, but just fine, and you haven't actually done the damage, whatever this yelling and screaming is. Another thing I'd like to see is repair satellites. So if someone does disable a satellite on orbit, like lasers or whatever, which is again in contravention of international law, but if it happens anyway, there is the ability to quickly and inexpensively send up something to undo the damage, to fix the damage, get it back on, and then all the trouble they went into to disable it, they get yelled at and screamed at, and they don't get the effect for all the expense they went through. That's going to discourage them from doing any more of that, a lot more than just the yelling and sanctions.
I agree with that. So yeah. I do agree with that, but still there's the thing, okay, who's going to pay for that, right? To again undo the damage that they're doing, right?
Space Force, come on. It's the mission of the US Space Force to do that kind of thing. Yeah. They are in operation. They're practically already budgeted to do that kind of thing. And again, I'm talking inexpensive stuff. I mean, $250,000 for a launch, maybe $250,000 for the repair satellite, if that, including cost of operation. What's $500,000 to a DoD budget?
Yeah.
Pocket change.
Yep. Okay, I do agree with that, obviously, and Space Force is great at doing that, and they know again what they're doing. I'm not going to argue on that point. My another point is with the just space debris overall, right? So I had some discussions with one of the individuals who is the president of the Portuguese Space Agency, and Ricardo Conde, that's his name. He proposed a very interesting thing. He was advocating for introducing like a tax, for companies that are littering in the space, right? In space, and especially for those large constellation operators that put a lot of satellites, a lot of debris that they produce, right, in long term. And basically that tax would be some sort of a function of, depending again of the amount of satellites they put into orbit and the amount of profit that they're making annually, right? So how do you feel that, and how open would that be for the companies? I mean, how can you enforce something like that? Do you believe there will be something
that is the problem? Good luck with that. I mean, it's like that AI freeze that people thought of, or people were proposing recently. It's just okay, it might make sense in theory if everyone went along with it. The people who are the biggest problems are not going to go along with it. China, Russia in general, and quite possibly quite a few of the US players who are contributing, but more the China and Russian and those guys are just not going to play along with it. And if they're not going to play along with it, then this really isn't addressing the problem. It's just another money grab from the people that you can bully into doing it. It's just, no.
Yeah,
you don't do that kind of thing unless you can do it fairly, and you can't do it fairly, so don't do it at all.
That was also obviously, I mean, it's a great idea, but it's just not going to happen realistically, right? So obviously that would be
that's one of the reasons why I think that the effective counter solutions would be better, because then you can do them fairly against everyone. If the debris is up there, then it doesn't really matter whose debris it is. Well, I mean, it does in a legal sense, and actually the chief attorneys of the Space Force are looking into this. Department of the Air Force Council, is okay. Could, say, Russia claim that the debris from its November 2021 ASAT is still Russian property, and therefore sue in U.S. courts any U.S. company that cleaned up its debris without its permission, which it's probably never going to get. But there is some argument to say that once it becomes small debris, it's effectively abandoned, and therefore under precedent can be considered to be not nationally flagged, but it's also being of human origin, not a celestial body, and therefore isn't legally protected.
Okay, that's a quite intricate situation still, right?
It is
a bit sophisticated and complicated to really understand that. And there's many, like with the space law, even though the space lawyers and the policymakers, they're doing a good job thinking, for now it somehow feels that they're only thinking, right? And there's very hard to make any decisive, and we're pretty much relying to some extent on, okay, let's see what's gonna happen and then learn from mistakes approach, right? So
if there are any lawyers listening to this, any lawyers new to their career, looking for a field in which they can make an impact, space law, I recommend. There are some existing precedents, but a lot of it is the major precedents are to be written. And you can get away with making arguments for any number of cases. There needs to be a lot more definition before we get to even as far as the airline industry, and certainly as far as like we are with maritime shipping.
And especially now as we're approaching those human missions like to moon and the permanent habitations there, and the Mars mission is also just around the corner, just across the across the hill, just some decade away, maybe, hopefully, right? So as we know, so that's going to be a huge problem, right? To really figure, okay, the employees, if it's a private company sending it, what if somebody decides to actually quit the job, right? When they're on the mission? I mean, what do? Do you cut off their supply? Do you still pay them? I mean, why you pay for the food, for all the resources, but you cannot also abandon the individual, right? To live him to die. So that's a quite complicated situation. And that's, again, I believe it's going to take a lot of thought process and a lot of decision making to really decide how to deal with those situations as well. So my next question for you, Adrian, is obviously CubeCab, great initiative, great idea. What is next? I mean, now where are you at the stage? You mentioned you were developing currently your launcher. You're now seeking for funding to finalize the design as well. So how it's going to play out? Give us the timeline, what to expect, and when can companies that are currently thinking of designing their own, again, CubeSats, when they can expect to be able to use your services for launch?
X plus 2 years, X being whenever the funding rounds close. I'm working multiple angles on this right now. Most of them have NDAs or equivalent in place. Some private capital, some government.
I see. Okay, wonderful. And if there's any investors, again, listening to this, you probably already approve Adrian's, again, projects that they're working on. So Adrian, would you be open if they reached out to you, and what is the best way for them to reach you? Is it through the website or through
email? Email,
okay.
atymes@cubecab.com.
Okay, so you heard it again. So and I encourage you to at least go and hear what Adrian has. I'm sure it's a great plan. Obviously, we have only just scratched the surface here of what internally Adrian and CubeCab have the plans to accomplish, but seems like a noble mission to me, and definitely worth giving it support and investment. So thank you, Adrian. Again, I believe that was majority. That was it for today. So we covered quite deeply some of the topics around CubeCab, the FedEx, the US.
So there are a couple other things my CFO wants me to mention.
Okay, absolutely. Go ahead.
So for example, we were second place for, you've heard of Starlink is servicing Ukraine?
Yes.
Yeah. We were the second place competition on that.
Oh, okay.
If Musk hadn't stepped up, and I salute him for what he's done, but if Musk hadn't stepped up, we would have been next. We providing a rapid deployment service, and if Russia did shoot our stuff down, well, hey, we can just launch additional ones. As is certain other countries are looking at, and I'm not allowed to say which ones, but a lot. So for all the new stuff, like the repair and the the anti-debris stuff and stuff, a lot of the interest we've been seeing has been from traditional uses, either small constellations that scale up. So you can do a starter service, prove it out, and get more funding and scale up more launches, or just individual one-off experiments of the sort that you find at a lot of universities and small companies, where just, we want to do this thing ASAP. For instance, some of the tales I've been regaled by from universities have been, it's taken 2 years now, maybe 1 year, but still they have a grad student make a thesis, make a satellite, file it, and then by the time it's launched, they're gone. So they need another grad student to do it or to launch it.
Yeah, and how disappointing is that, right? I mean, you work so hard to develop it, and you don't really get to launch it, right? Finalize it.
Whereas with our launch service, one of the things we're trying to enable is doing a year-long undergrad class. Now, I'm a University of California grad, so we're thinking academic quarters instead of semesters. But so fall quarter, you teach the theory. Winter quarter, they build the satellite. Spring break, launch a satellite. Having filed for the stuff at the beginning of the academic year, that's 6 or so months. Yeah, they can definitely get a launch in that time. They can't with existing stuff, not that fast. But with us, yeah, no problem. And then the spring quarter, they operate the satellite in orbit and deorbit it for final exam. Heck of a final exam. So the satellite winds up re-entered and not contributing to orbital debris. I mean, it's been on for less than a year, let alone less than 5. The students graduate having done something in space, quite a sellable skill these days, and we get repeat customer every year.
I mean, that's awesome, and I'm sure that's going to encourage even more of those university and academic projects from universities. Once again, your technology is out there and they're aware. Yeah. So
another thing I will give out just for free from what we've found is when you're developing new capabilities, radical new capabilities like this, theoretically the government's willing to fund this kind of thing. Theoretically, they have like the SBIR and other programs to do this. A lot of times they don't have identified program offices or like that to use these new capabilities. It's just, oh, well, so you have this new thing nobody's ever been done before. How do you use it in this context? Well, we don't have anyone use this in context, then we can't actually pay you for it. There are efforts in the government to overcome that. Anyone who specifically been involved with the SBIR program or STTR and is trying to get to what's called the phase 3. I'm going to put a jingle out for IDIQ labs at gsa.gov. They're a government service or general service administration team that's trying to reform the process of getting from you had an initial R&D contract to you get what's called a phase 3, and which is commercialization. These guys are trying to reform that. So you got any questions about that, give them a shout.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Adrian, for the advice. So my next question again for you, and it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, which again, I appreciate you for not making the mistake which many companies in space are making, which is, again, a lot of companies, they believe that they first have to have a technology and only then they start marketing, they start business development, which is a crucial mistake, right, that you can make as a company. So, how do you, obviously you're making it right, but how different would be your
case if you haven't done that? I have made my career off of that.
Yes.
Even before CubeCab. So I have a private lab, which I call WingCat Solution, WingCat Solutions. It's from WingCat was my grade school nickname. So it's been called tech scavenging. It's been called a bunch of other things as well, where you have here's the technology. How can you use it? You matchmake. You find customers for these particular things, and say, okay, so here's a way that you can solve it. Or you find people who are in need of new ways of solving the problems, and you do a little research to see, okay, are there novel technologies that will solve this kind of thing? Now, it's 2023. You would think that most young people getting into business would know how to Google.
Not really.
Yeah. I mean, I'll admit, I grew up kind of cheating. I had access in the 80s to the kind of internet that most people didn't get until the 2000s. I was on the BBSs, I had a CompuServe account, and so on and so forth. So I grew up in grade school doing the equivalent of Google searches before it was Google. My thesis at UCLA was the first one written in HTML and designed to be published on the web, because right after the World Wide Web came out. You'd think computer science department, there would have been more before 96, but no. Oh well. Anyway, but yeah, I have grown up doing this kind of research, this kind of find a use for the thing and let the use case influence how you're making the technology.
That's awesome, and I didn't know that about the internet access. So that's that was back in what year you mentioned that, Adrian? So
in the 1980s. mid 80s.
1980s. Oh, wow. So that's like 15 years before, right? Pretty much something similar.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that was grade school for me. So,
yeah,
oh,
that
yeah.
was awesome. Yeah, I mean the thing with the Google is there's like, if before there was no information, now there's too much of it, right? And it's very hard to even understand. And the worst thing is there's a lot of this inaccurate data that's out there. And
Yeah.
you just get lost in the noise with the right data, right? So it's
I know there was an ancient Greek philosopher, I forget it was like Socrates or Plato or someone else, who even back then said that the amount of information being produced, the amount of useful trades and stuff, was so rapid that no one person in their lifetime could learn it all.
yes.
Even back then. That's still true today. I mean, more obviously, a lot more so today.
That's true, yeah, because the philosophy back then was just knowing everything about anything, right? So
Yeah.
in those days, but then it became literally now it's even to master one field, right? If we're talking about one field, it's probably not possible until the end of the lifetime because it's developing so rapidly. Probably by the time you learn one thing, there's 10 more new things that have been developed, right?
I have written science fiction on the side about neural implant technologies, based partly on some research I did on some of my startups, um, where a person has direct mental access to the entire internet. And I'm not the only one who's written this kind of thing. There's plenty of others. Um, but yeah, it's just when you can think and query out to find the information, even then, that's not the same thing as actually having all the information.
Tell me about that. That's very interesting. I mean, regarding the sci-fi generally, what's your favorite sci-fi book?
It varies by my mood.
Okay, varies by your mood. So, and if we're talking about like a space side,
Right. So like there's been some good Star Wars and Star Trek
yes.
things that I've seen. Quite a lot of independent science fiction. In fact, right now I've been asked to write a science fiction book for a certain role-playing game setting. Traveler. I don't suppose you've heard of it.
No,
Okay.
not yet. But again, everybody gonna hear it now. Who's listening
Okay.
to this? So.
Very, very, very brief. It is one of the oldest modern role-playing game systems. About as old as Dungeons and Dragons, except it's had one consistent setting, whereas D&D's had a whole bunch.
Mhm.
It is what Firefly and Serenity were based on.
Mhm.
Literally, Joss Whedon said he based it on old RPGs, and people did some tracing, and it was most likely Traveler that he was referring to. He didn't actually say, but um, it supports that style play and a few others. And I've written a few articles for the current publisher, Mongoose Publishing, and based on that, the lead author of their recent spaceships book said, "Yeah, Adrian, you want to rewrite this lore book they had back from the last published in the '80s that says how all the starship technologies work?" So just okay. Been working on the side. It's due out later this year. The book's name is Starship Operator's Manual.
Mhm. And where can individuals listening to this follow again that? So where they can find updates regarding that?
So just look for Mongoose Publishing Starship Operators Manual. We submit the manuscript to them end of the month, and I don't know how long it'll take them to do the editing and art, but I'm pretty sure it'll be out sometime this year.
So
Um,
probably majority of the individuals watching this again on YouTube or on the podcast, right? So
right.
they will be able to see this right now, even without
Yeah.
waiting,
Well,
right?
I'll admit that the setting has a few science fantasy elements that, well, we're writing to the existing settings, so we're obligated to have. Like, it posits jump space as faster than light. It posits the existence of artificial gravity and a few other things. Within those caveats, we've tried to do it be as hard science as possible. For instance, the entire reaction drives set chapter is based on current understandings as applied to that setting. Where, okay, fusion is possible and is commonly done, so nuclear thermal drives, closed cycle in the current terminology, are the main method of reaction drives, as they call them.
And how big of an impact would that be, Adrian, as we're talking like nuclear propulsion and thermonuclear propulsion on the space travel intergalactic? So what an impact would that have?
Oh, I've actually had to do some analyses with regard to what would happen if it was introduced in real life.
Mhm.
Um, so on the one hand, it would be radically better delta V, radically better specific impulse. On the other hand, it is nuclear, so you do need to take extra precautions to keep it what's called closed cycle, which is basically no radioactive exhaust. And even with that, it's got the word nuclear in it, so people are going to be protesting its mere existence.
Mhm.
So you have to find a way to do it on the small scale and very safe, and otherwise do it politically safe. But if you could do it, that would get the cost of space access down to not that much higher than long-range airplane travel tickets.
Mhm. And what would be, again, as we're talking about nuclear, what would be your standpoint on just the nuclear energy itself as a source for powering humanity, even on Earth or in space, right? So how would you compare that as opposed to other sources of energy like solar, for example, right? So solar may be working here, but is solar going to work, let's say, on Mars because it's further away? Is it going to work on other interplanetary missions just overall?
So I have two major thoughts on that. So first thought is ground-based. Nuclear versus other non-renewables, because yes, nuclear does take fuel, and so people say, oh, well, why don't you just use the infinite fuel solar and wind? Well, a better comparison is nuclear to, say, coal or the like.
Mm-hmm.
And now, which one's more radioactive? People say, well, nuclear, obviously. Actually,
Well, not really, right?
you look at the emissions. Coal is more radioactive than nuclear.
It's much cleaner. Yeah.
In addition
There's
to all
been
the other bad
just
stuff
some
the
bad
puts out.
examples with this, not offending anybody from the, green movement or anything like that, right? So that's, but talking from a green movement perspective itself, right? So,
right.
It is much cleaner as opposed to coal. We know that it's a fact, and there's been some cases like Chernobyl, for example, and that's again a tragedy. But that was not because of a nuclear energy itself. That was because of the failed procedures that happened right out there, and everybody knows the story, I'm sure.
And the modern designs are made so that even if you try to screw up like that, you can't.
Yeah.
Because back then it's like, oh well, nobody's going to screw up like that, and then people did. So, okay, people can screw up like that. People can be that idiotic. Make sure they can't.
Yep.
Learn from failure. Make sure that failure doesn't happen again. Modern designs are pretty good at that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. The second one is solar. So another thing I've been pushing and poking at on the back end is lunar manufactured space-based solar power. So space-based solar power is you have these solar power satellites in orbit doing all the energy gathering up there, beaming it down to Earth. There are ways to beam it down where it's safe for wildlife, even if the birds fly through the beams, they're not going to get cooked.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has the advantages of, well, one, lower cost once you get up past the initial stuff, and I'll get to that in a moment. Two, easier deployment to, shall we say, crisis-affected areas, whether that be war or natural disaster, whatever. A rectangular array is pretty simple to port in and set up, and then boom, the community has power, even if it doesn't have wires to the rest of the world. And three, it has certain advantages for mobile power, which, granted, that's mostly Department of Defense, but hey, get their money to make it better for the rest of the world in a way that doesn't blow up people? Sure. Okay, so the cost is the big thing. The main reason it hasn't been done yet is that it is way expensive to get the satellites large enough to be effective up there. Now, there's been some research on getting the satellites smaller for unit amount of power, and launch costs have been coming down. That's not quite enough. What looks like it will be enough, even with a bit more launch cost dropping, will be getting some smelting, manufacturing, refining capability up on the moon. A lot of the lunar soil is silicon. What's the main component of solar cells? Silicon. It is possible to manufacture solar cells on the moon. There's going to be a little bit of R&D, but not much needed. Mostly it's just you get the industrial equipment up there, you get the mining equipment up there and refining, you start making the solar panels, and maybe you launch them to lower orbit. One study CubeCab did was specifically at NASA's invitation to study drone satellites that can take solar panels off of end-of-life satellites. Some satellites end of life after 5 years, but a lot of the solar panels are good to out to 15. Mm-hmm. So just take the solar panels off of them and either use them to replace other satellites' damaged ones, or allow other satellites to be launched without solar panels, saving on launch costs, you're launching less mass, and have these used solar panels attached to them on orbit. A lot less mass going through, a lot less cost for everyone all around. You get that, you start getting a market for solar panels in orbit, into which, if you then have lunar manufacturing launching solar panels, you're just launching into an existing market, economic bootstrapping. There's a few other steps needed to bootstrap the lunar manufacturing part itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's great. Obviously, if we really want to make self-sufficient again places, well, on the moon that's going to be challenges because you cannot really have the plant life on the moon just because of the day-night cycle. There's like 28.
Well, not outside, but
Yeah,
inside.
yeah,
The approach demonstrated on the Martian would work on the moon too.
yeah. Well, that wasn't interesting, even though there were some scientific.
Some details, but I mean the
Yeah.
rough general idea of you enclose the space, you import biological matter, import soil, and from the source that he did, and you set up an artificial environment. Yeah, plants will grow there, in theory, if you keep it contained and life support approved, life support and so on. And yeah, it's
There's been quite a few researches on that done, I believe, on analog astronaut training facilities all across the Earth in different places. They've been researching a lot that, and there's been even, I believe it was developed by JPL, the Mars simulant, right? So the soil, and it has again proved that it's possible to grow plants. So obviously, so that's definitely a thing to utilize. So solar power obviously is awesome. It's cleaner. It's clean. It's great. But does it have the potential output, Adrian, that you would believe will be enough again on Earth, if we're talking just on Earth, to support the growth of the technological demand?
The key is to build up enough capacity over time, which is certainly possible. The maximum possible. You ever heard of the phrase Dyson sphere or Dyson swarm? Well, maybe you already have. So I'll just okay. So it's this concept taken to a complete stellar level. You have a swarm of these covering most of the orbit around the sun, not just in the Earth's plane, but all over. You can get radically more times than the Earth, humanity uses per year in power generation.
That's an interesting concept. And there's been many other also proposals regarding extracting against solar powers, and but on Earth again it's challenging. But there's been some proposals of grabbing again. It's a bit similar to what you mentioned, the orbital mirrors. I think that was the name for the proposal, to just simply reflect the beams back on the surface. Right.
There was this old video game, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, which had a quote about this. I was trying to remember what it was. Something. Unimaginable amounts of power stream past our planet every second. It's ours for the taking if we can just stretch our arms wide enough. This was from the industrialist character in the game. But yeah, it's basically true.
I mean, Sid Meier's had some great games in the past. Yeah, I personally played. I think it was Civilization. That was the name of the game. I mean, have you tried it before?
I believe I've done all 6 iterations of Civ so far, and I look forward to the upcoming 7.
Yeah, I mean, it was great, especially at the end. You get to the spaceship and to develop space travel. I mean,
the space victory has been by far the most common one I've gotten in the latest iteration.
Yes, that's amazing. Okay. So on this great note, I think Adrian will conclude again this episode. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. I personally enjoyed it. Had some fun, right? And hopefully we'll have you back as well sometime in the near future. Once again, you have the great updates, and we'll be cheering you on again in your journey.
Yeah, and anyone looking for updates from us who just wants to passively follow, we're currently on Twitter and Facebook. That might change given recent things for Twitter, but for now, they'll continue to be the plan. So just follow us on Twitter or Facebook, and if we get funded, if we seriously start development, that's where we'll announce. So just follow us there.
Yes, absolutely. And for the individuals, again, who want to follow your story besides the Twitter and Facebook as well, they can check you at the website, so CubeCab.com. Right.
Yeah. So, and I believe the info at CubeCab.com or sales at CubeCab.com email, one of those email addresses or both are linked to from there. So just go to the site and find email and email there, and eventually get to me.
All right. Wonderful. Okay, Adrian. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks everybody for tuning in for today. And keep in mind, again, there's many more exciting discussions that's going to be coming in.